Jose Manuel Alvarez. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Dear friends, happy to address this year's virtual Global Town Hall. The organization of this crucial event to reflect on the main global issues of our times that we are facing in an era marked by rapid changes and uncertainty is very timely. From conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza to the technological advances and artificial intelligence, from the existential threats posed by climate change to food security, the challenge to our democracies or the international architecture that stands for the defense of human rights and international law are large. Although these issues might seem overwhelming and our resilience might be tested, we must find a strength in our partnership, working with allies and friends. International society is undergoing three major long-term shifts that place our society before new horizons. First, in world politics, we witness what we can call a shift from the rules to power with greater use of force in defiance of international law. Second, global economy is transitioning toward greater emphasis on economic security and resilience. This goes hand in hand with increasing fragmentation, trade barrier, or weaponization of technology. Third, we see a growing sense of pessimism in our society, a creeping doubt about what the future might be. These three shifts are closely intertwined and suggest an increasingly divisive style of politics, both domestically and internationally. It's in these moments of challenge that we must work on our capacity to innovate, to collaborate, to raise above the difficulties. Now, where are these struggles more evident than in Ukraine and Gaza? Russian aggression has created the worst European security crisis in recent times. It has demonstrated the high cost of being transactional when it comes to principles that are universal, such as sovereignty and territorial integrity. For that, the Ukrainian struggle represents much more than the survival of Ukraine. Ukraine is a touchstone for the future of an international order that upholds freedom and independence, whether large or small can be the country. Spain supports Ukraine's fight for its freedom and sovereignty as long as it takes. And on the other hand, Gaza, we have been shocked by the number of victims, mostly women and children, the devastation, the ongoing suffering that has become a powerful symbol of the urgent need for peace and multilateral cooperation. Peace is precisely what guided us in our decision to recognize the state of Palestine last May. For peace, for justice, for sheer human dignity. We want Israel and Palestine coexisting in peace and security. Spain is firmly committed with multilateralism, and we have been consistent in the demand for respect for international law, including international humanitarian law. In a world so interconnected, addressing such a profound global challenges requires collective effort. Thus, why we work together with our European partners and with our friends and allies. We need a strong alliance and the full engagement of institutions like United Nations to foster dialogue, to coordinate our response to crisis, and to uphold the principles of human rights and justice. I wish you a fruitful debate and exchange of ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And with that, we'll begin the fifth session of the Global Town Hall, Eyes on Palestine and Ukraine, Valuable Lessons for the Present and Future World Order. I now invite the moderator of the session, Senior International Correspondent for Al Jazeera Network. Please welcome Step Besson.
Well, thank you so much, and welcome everyone in Indonesia, but also around the world to this session, one of the most important sessions of the day. But of course, as a moderator, I like to say that, Eyes on Palestine and Ukraine, valuable lessons for the present and future world order. Very painful, very bloody, murderous lessons, I have to say. My name is Step Vaas, and I have been a correspondent for Al Jazeera English for the past 18 years, first in Asia. I was based in Indonesia for a very long time, and now I'm covering Europe. I've been to Ukraine, covered the war there, and this year I've been very busy with the fallout of the war in Gaza, especially here in Europe. I've been covering all the international court cases in The Hague against Israel. So it's a topic that is very close to my heart. And what we've seen, of course, here in the West is that there has been a very different treatment of the invasion, Russia's invasion in Ukraine, which was widely condemned in the West here and in the United States, of course, as well. But a very different approach when Israel started bombing Gaza until today. We're now 9 months into this relentless war. And the tone, of course, has been very, very different coming here from Europe and from the United States. And one term that has been mentioned a lot of times is double standards. So we are going to dig into this situation and look into the double standards here in this session. How can they be explained? How can we overcome this division, basically? And also, at the end, of course, we will hope to find some kind of answers and maybe move a little bit closer to a solution to world peace. That's what we always want in these kinds of conversations, of course, especially with such extinguished guests that I now have the honor to introduce to you. First of all, Dr. Comfort Aero. She is the president and CEO of the International Crisis Group, which is one of the most prominent think tanks in the world. Then the second guest is Mr. Bob Dean. He is the head of security of the unit of Klingendael Institute. And that's another very well-known think tank based in the Netherlands. And then we have Khairi Jamaluddin. He's the former Minister of Health in Malaysia and also a co-host to a very prominent podcast, a very popular podcast, I understand, Keluar Kejap, which means out of the moment. So we're coming to you from 3 different time zones right now, or 4 even, I think. And I will start with Dr. Comfort Aero. I've mentioned the word double standard. The West is treating President Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, as a war criminal. And the treatment for Benjamin Netanyahu is very different. He's basically given a green light by the West to relentlessly bomb very often innocent civilians in Gaza. There's a lot of explanations mentioned for this kind of different treatment. Many people say maybe it has a historical reason. Of course, what happened in the Holocaust that's a reason that especially is given to why Germany is still unconditionally supporting Israel. But what is your take? How do you see this different kind of treatment?
Thank you, and it's a real pleasure to join you all, and thank you for the very kind introduction that you gave to me also, Step. I mean, this is really interesting. I think one thing also just to add to what you said is that it's true how the West has positioned itself vis-a-vis Ukraine and Israel, but the court of public opinion has a different take also, because we have now Israel, for the first time in the history of the International Criminal Court, being a subject of the court itself. And then you had the decision by South Africa to take the case of Israel to the International Court of Justice as well, in an era that a number of us have defined also as the era of impunity. So I think we could come back to what this means for international justice writ large. I think also
because for especially, excuse me to interrupt, but because these rulings so far have been very much ignored, and that's basically also what I'm getting at if I'm talking about the different treatment.
Yeah, but I also think that it's clarifying for Israel, because I think oftentimes Israeli government itself hasn't appreciated the view of sort of other international actors beyond the West. This is the first time that there's been heavy criticism by a number of non-Western countries vis-a-vis Israel. But I also think it's important to view Ukraine separately from Israel. This was a war of aggression by Russia into Ukraine, and there is just regardless of where you stand, we can't ignore what happened on the 7th of October. Now, I think you raise an important point about double standards. When when the West was refusing to appreciate the fallout of Ukraine, there was an attempt by a number of Western governments to listen to what developing countries were saying. I mean, a number of developing countries refused to take sides on Ukraine for various reasons, largely in relation to their relationship with Russia as well. Now, some Western leaders did acknowledge that they needed to do more to address the concerns of double standards, namely the fact that they took a principled position vis-a-vis one European nation and haven't taken that same principled position vis-a-vis countries that are as devastating as Sudan, as Ethiopia, as Myanmar, that were happening at the same time. But I think you're quite right that if the war in Gaza posed the first test, for example, of Western leaders had understood the widespread sort of perception of the hypocrisy, they failed miserably when it came squarely to Gaza. Because put simply, there's a widespread belief, as you hinted in your presentation, that the United States and some Western leaders have greenlit, have given light to much of the destruction that we're seeing happening in Gaza. Despite the horror of what happened on the 7th, there's still a sense in which the Western leaders have ignored, have allowed President Netanyahu to continue on this destructive path. And that's a perception, strong perception, that's coming from a number of Western leaders. So this is why we're in this very tense situation that we're seeing today.
Yes, exactly. And so we have more than 40,000 people dead already. I want to now go to Bob Dane and ask him about this double standards. You are based in the Netherlands. How do you explain it? Because I think a lot of people worldwide are trying to understand and are failing to understand why is it so different. Can you give a shot at explaining it?
Thank you so much, Step. And indeed, good morning, everybody, from the Netherlands, from The Hague, the city of peace and justice, where exactly this court case that Step mentioned is taking place. It is very difficult to explain. I'm not sure if I have one reason. I think there's a couple. One is, of course, politics and geopolitics. So Western countries use the language of international law to condemn what the Russian Federation does in Ukraine, and very rightfully so, in my view, but don't use the same terms as often when they treat Israel. Why is that? There's geopolitical reasons for this. The Russian Federation forms a direct threat to the security of Europe. So it's in Europe's interest that Russia doesn't win this war in Ukraine, and that very strongly supports Ukraine and wants the rest of the world to condemn the Russian Federation. While Israel is a very important partner, especially for the United States, in the Middle East. And countries, and I think this is not unique to Western Europe or North America, countries tend to be a little bit nicer when it comes to their friends than when it comes to countries they consider rivals or even enemies. So I think that's the first one. So
it's not about a feeling of guilt, historic guilt about what happened in the Holocaust, as you often hear in the Netherlands and in Germany, for example, as an explanation to support Israel unconditionally.
I think to Netherlands and Germany, that does apply, actually. And the Netherlands, if I can zoom in on my own country, it's one of the countries that is with the current government, one of the staunchest supporters of Israel, and has even suggested in the government agreement to move the embassy to Jerusalem. I think that partially plays a role, but I think it's also partially politics and geopolitics. Second point I wanted to make, it's not only countries outside of Western Europe that are upset about this. The Ukrainians themselves have also been very upset that, for example, Western warplanes have been used, US planes and French and UK, to shoot down missiles coming from Iran towards Israel, while as NATO air defense cannot be used to shoot down missiles coming from Russia to attack Ukraine. So it's also Ukrainians who complain about different treatment. And finally, and I think it's important to point out, as Dr. Ero said, this is not a unified position across the entire country. For example, in the Netherlands, we had protests at universities happening even today about support for Israel. We even have diplomats protesting in front of their own foreign ministry to complain about double standards, and some have resigned. So this is also something that is dividing Western countries. And also you see a lack of unity inside the European Union and in the West, where lately 3 countries, including Spain, have actually recognized the state of Palestine, whereas other EU countries have not. So there's not a unified position across the West, if I can point that out.
Yeah, and we will get to that, and especially also what you mentioned, the recognition of Palestine as a state, which is increasingly happening all over the globe. I now want to go to Khairi Jamaluddin. I think I can call you KJ. Are you with us? Because of course, Malaysia has a very different perspective on the situation, both in Ukraine and in Israel. So I really would like to hear your perspective on the idea that there is a double standard, and how Malaysia is looking at, for example, at Russia. There has also been some accusations that Malaysia, of course, is also trying to undermine sanctions towards Russia, which also could be called double standard. So where is Malaysia standing, and how can you explain this?
Thank you, Step. Can you hear me? Can I just do a quick sound check?
I can hear you.
100%.
Yeah,
thank you.
You're there.
Yes. Look, when the conflict in Ukraine began, and I want to explain Malaysia's position first. When the resolutions were put forward at the United Nations, Malaysia supported the resolution to call for Russia to pull out and to end the conflict in Ukraine. This is in line with our national position that upholds the principles of sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity. So when we are called to account, we will be there and we will lend our support to what we believed was a rules-based international order. And we played our part when it came to Ukraine. Sadly, that same rules-based international order failed the Palestinians once again. And it has constantly failed the Palestinians. And I'm referring to the worst genocide, perhaps in our generation, our lifetime, what's happening in Gaza today. So as far as Malaysia is concerned, we're very consistent. We don't take a different view what's happened in Ukraine.
But Malaysia has been, excuse me to interrupt, Malaysia has been accused of undermining sanctions, or even doing business still with Russia, selling chips, for example, for the production of weapons. So there has been this idea that Malaysia is still very much backing or supporting Russia. Is that correct?
Backing or supporting? No. I mean, we have voiced our concerns and we voted together with the majority of the international community, you can say against Russia. But in terms of how we conduct our bilateral diplomacy and bilateral relations with Russia, that is for us to decide. For instance, if you want to go down the road of sanctions, we can talk about how sanctions have been weaponized by the West against Russia in the first place, how the US dollar has been weaponized against Russia and other countries in the first place. So where do you draw the line? So we have made our position clear at the highest forum of international relations with the United Nations. We continue to speak out against any violation of territorial integrity. Our Prime Minister was just in Vladivostok with President Vladimir Putin, where he spoke at length not just about Gaza, but also the principles of dispossession. And I think that didn't go over the head of President Vladimir Putin, where even if diplomatically the Prime Minister didn't.
Sorry, I want to move on.
Yeah.
I want to ask you what you think of the accusation of double standardness from the West towards Israel and its war in Gaza. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, it's clear. It is. I mean, I agree with both Dr. Comfort and Bob just now that what is being perceived in the global South, as well as other parts in the West. I think it's very important what both Dr. Comfort and Bob said just now. I don't want to have this homogenous view of the West, saying that everyone in the West is perpetuating this hypocrisy, because even within the Western countries, you have a huge swathe of population who are against this hypocrisy, which is being perpetrated by I think certain key countries and the leadership of those certain key countries. I think the political view in the West is far more complex than just saying that the West is hypocritical about this. I think it is much more textured and nuanced than that.
I want to now move on to the two-state solution, and I want to ask Bob Dane. You said the Netherlands is not really coming forward, right? There's a lot of countries still in Europe, and it's very much a minority, because a majority in the world is now recognizing Palestine as a nation. I was actually in Oslo when Norway declared its the acceptance of Palestine. A very historical moment. But there's a lot of countries also still in Europe who are still not accepting Palestine as a state. Why is that, and why is it so difficult to do that? Because they're in a minority right now.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I'm not sure how many exactly right now. I think it's about 10 EU countries that have recognized Palestine. I think Malta, Slovenia are considering, haven't quite done it yet. Sweden was, of course, one of the first. This is domestic politics in countries. For example, in the Netherlands, this is often a debate between countries that are more on the left of the political spectrum, that are in favor of a two-state solution, and parties that are more on the right or the conservative, who are much more supportive of Israel and don't want a two-state solution. I think that applies across the board. Exactly as Kylie said, this is a very nuanced thing. This is debated hotly within societies. But I think by and large, if I can speak for the Netherlands, the majority in parliament continues to hold the view that this should maybe eventually happen, but right now support for Israel is stronger. And I think a lot of it also has to do with the geopolitical overlay of what is happening. Because if there would be a chance at a good peace agreement that would allow both states to develop harmoniously, I think that people would see more support. Then, for example, when things like October 7th happened, which was a major backlash for those who argued for a two-state solution inside Western countries, who then had to say what just had happened on October 7th was, of course, a major disaster for this. So I think again, you have to zoom in on individual countries for this.
Dr. Ero, do you think a two-state solution is the solution, and how realistic is it?
I mean, it's not even on the table right now for either side, you know, in Israel or even on the Palestinian side. I mean, I think we first we need to end the war, get the ceasefire, restore the humanitarian situation, pretty devastating in Gaza, before you start thinking of what a political horizon looks like. What is very clear, however, and this is what the lessons of the last 12 months have taught us, is that you cannot ignore the political aspirations, the rights of the Palestinian people. You cannot continue to shove this under the bus. It partly explains why there's also difficulty or reluctance among a number of the Arab states just to go straight forward with a continuation of normalization as well, because they also realize that you can't continue to ignore the fate and the aspirations of Palestinians as well. So we're far away from any discussion of a two-state solution. I think most people in the Palestinian community and even beyond see that we've spent 30 years paying lip service to this idea. And I think before we even get to that situation, we need to start thinking first of how we end the war, how we get a credible ceasefire, one that neither side backs away from, one that neither side continues to shift from its demands. And then you begin to talk more coherently about how you begin to restore some kind of governance into Gaza. There is, of course, question marks about the internal politics within the Palestinian Authority to decide who begins to lead any form of governance in the country. But quite frankly, we're really far away from any kind of conversation. And I think quite frankly, a lot of faith, a lot of trust has been lost about that. And thinking about a political horizon is going to be a very tough question. Nobody trusts either side to deliver on this question anyway.
And maybe even more so because we talked about the changing world order, right? And if you talk about this double standard and also international justice, we talked about The Hague and the rulings against Israel also, that it should stop possible genocidal acts in Gaza, which it has ignored. If you see that the world is so divided about this, what kind of world order are we going to, and how can this world order make sure that these conflicts come to an end?
I mean, Steph, I would even take a step backward because everybody's focused rightfully on Gaza. Simultaneously, because you asked for the two-state solution, simultaneously, we have to pay attention to what is happening right now in Gaza. I mean, sorry, in the West Bank.
Okay.
In the West Bank. Because you cannot talk about a two-state solution while you're watching what is happening in the West Bank today, where, I mean, stemming the Israeli settler violence is at the roots also. We're seeing a rise and spike since, Israel's presence in government, since they took over the government, and also as a result of Gaza, where you're just seeing a dangerous uptick in violence there. So how do you begin to talk about a two-state solution when one of the at the heart of that is what is happening, the devastating situation that's happening to Palestinians in occupied West Bank? And now to your other question.
Exactly. My question is, who is going to talk about it if everyone is so divided?
Yeah, and at the Security Council, you can't even have a coherent debate, a resolution that sticks for a long time. I think it's very hard to continue to talk about sort of rules-based international order. Whose rules are you talking about? When it's been broken, nobody trusts a number of these countries that continue to talk about rules-based orders. Some qualified, as our minister in Malaysia rightfully said, as Western-based international rules-based order. This is not based on a universal understanding of this as well. Also, it's very difficult to talk about it when the key principles of neutrality, of impartiality have been undermined. When the Security Council resolutions are undermined as well, when key P5 member states, countries, do one thing and break the rules. So the rule makers are also today the rule breakers as well. So it's very hard to talk about that. So we are now in a situation where nobody trusts either side. A number of developing countries, rising middle powers, as you wish, are setting their own rules, shaping the rules as they go forward, understand that their national interest must drive the solution. So I think it's a murky situation right now. It's a very bleak situation right now, Steph. I think we need to find a way in which we restore faith in key international institutions, primarily the United Nations as well.
And one power that could play maybe a very important role in this is the global South. And I know I've read your article about you can't really talk about the global South as a entity, basically, of course, because there's so many different countries in the global South. But I want to use this term anyway to make it more clear. And I want to ask Khairi Jamaluddin about this. What could the global South, if we can just use this simplified term, do in this situation right now, with this changing world order, with a lot of distrust and also the international justice system going downhill? What can the global South do?
I think it's a very important crossroads for, as you said, I mean, it's a problematic term, but let's just use it for shorthand anyway, the global South, to try to define something that comes out of this crisis that we have, a crisis of confidence, a crisis of trust that we have towards the present liberal Western-based world order. For us to really together, not just the global South, but reach out to the West and to other countries, bigger countries, in trying to come up with a consensus about what kind of world we want to live in. We've, I think, for far too long lived in a world order which has been written by, as mentioned just now, the rule makers who are the rule breakers. And that has created a tremendous loss of trust and confidence in the South. We need to get together, whether it is through traditional forums like the non-aligned movement or something more fashionable like BRICS, to say that, look, even for us in the global South, we value freedom. We do not support oppression. We do not support dispossession. We value territorial integrity. We don't want to give the excuse as though this new order that comes or consensus that comes from the global south departs from universalist principles, and that's something that we can discuss together with our Western partners. And I think that's very important. And I think the key message is that for far too long you've relied on this world order, which never included us from the south. When you came up with the foundations and the institutions, those institutions are led and frankly controlled by a handful of countries who choose when they want to adhere to the world order and the rules that underpin the world order. So I think we have to have this frank conversation, not just in the South, but importantly reaching out to the West.
But still, at the moment, for example, everyone is talking, or a lot of people are talking about the United States elections, as if that's the key moment when things are going to change again. Like the world is looking a lot to those elections there. Do you think that is still the way we should look at the United States, or should we have a different perspective?
Well, I mean, you can't have an isolationist United States. I mean, that will not be good for the world, because we are inextricably linked in so many different ways. But at the same time, I don't think that in business there's a term called key man risk. When one person is not there, the entire corporation fails. So we should not have a key country risk at the same time, where if the United States doesn't do anything, the whole world comes to grinding to a halt. So I do think that we're not taking sides here. I'm not saying that we should take sides in this great geopolitical rivalry between the United States, China / Russia, or whatever it is. But I think we need to acknowledge that the world has become more multipolar. We have to ensure that everyone comes to the table, sits at the table. We must, as you said, Step, perhaps move away from the fact that the world stops until we see who wins, Harris or Trump, and then we decide what to do. I think it's time that we start setting the narrative, saying that, okay, whoever comes into office, whether it's Trump, whether it's Harris, this is what the rest of the world thinks. What are you going to do about it? And I think that's the right way of doing it, rather than waiting for them to shove their worldview onto us.
And Bob Dane, what do you think with the elections in the US coming? And of course, this is the election year 2024. We had many crucial elections this year. How will this affect the war in Ukraine, for example? We have already been hearing, of course, that there's a growing reluctance to financially support Ukraine. Ukraine is definitely struggling, although we have seen some very interesting incursions into Russia recently. How do you see the impact on the war in Ukraine, and even also on the war in Gaza?
No, I think it's crucial, and whether we like it or not, whatever the next US administration is going to do is going to shape some of these outcomes. For example, if President Trump would decide to pull all military aid out of Ukraine, no more aid, it is going to be very difficult for Europeans to step up and fill that void. And then President Zelensky would be in a very uncomfortable position and might have to make a deal that is more on Russia's terms. Whereas if a Harris administration, where we know her vice president pick, Waltz, is already quite in favor of support for Ukraine, would actually ramp up support and would allow some of the US munitions to be used on Russian territory, that could actually change the course of the war. So what we see at the moment is that both sides in this war, Ukraine and Russia, are actually fighting, and the intensity of the fighting is increasing because they are preparing for that moment of November, and then whenever the new administration comes in January, to have the best possible position if it would come to the negotiation table. Because I think that's the question we're all waiting for. When would talks start in earnest? And here I would like to pick up, if you allow me, Step, on something that Heidi just said on the role of, if I may use the contested term, Global South partners. You see that they are the only ones who are currently able to act as in between, as mediators. Which countries have Russia and Ukraine gone to? They've gone to Qatar, they've gone to Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, the Saudis. I've seen President Zelensky asking the Prime Minister of India if he could please be a mediator. So we are indeed moving to a world where the US can no longer only dictate the outcomes, but in fact also the US and Western Europe will need partners from elsewhere in the world in order to achieve major foreign policy objectives, including bringing peace to Ukraine.
Thank you. With this, we close the first half of this session. We're going to go now to discussants who are going to pose questions to either one of you from the outside. And I first want to invite Sean Connor. He's the Executive Director of the International Peace Bureau. Please let us know your question and to who.
Yes, thank you. I think I'll be posing my question to all of the speakers insofar as they would like to address it. But what I would like to bring in here is some concepts that we at the International Peace Bureau have been working on. One is very relevant, that in a few weeks we'll have the Summit of the Future at the United Nations in New York. And there is this question of what is the future of global governance there. One of the answers that we have been working with is Secretary General Antonio Guterres's new agenda for peace and the concept of collective security that he uses, rebuilding, restoring trust, solidarity, and universality to the international order. So I'd like to hear how you could see this concept coming in and playing a role in resolving these crises. And on the other hand, we also have been working with the idea of common security. It's a quite similar term, but more based on the interstate level rather through international institutions. The concept originated out of the 1982 Olof Palme security report. During the Cold War competition that we saw at the time, there was an understanding that came in the 1980s that no one state can make itself more secure at the expense of another state, and that in doing so, this can actually lead deeper to conflict. Therefore, what is really needed to restore trust between peoples and nations and to avoid escalation of conflicts is demilitarization, disarmament, and of course, in modern times, many political leaders are saying this is nearly impossible to achieve given the tensions that we have. But in the 1980s, of course, the tensions were very high during the Cold War. So we actually see that it is increasingly important that we focus on disarmament now. Do you see any chance that there could be disarmament in the current climate? And if so, could this help actually to have these discussions to resolve issues, to focus more on diplomacy rather than necessarily on military solutions to the crisis in Ukraine, the Russian invasion, as well as the crisis in Gaza? So that would be my question to you all. Thank you.
Thanks for your question. To who? Because I think you have to choose one.
I do have to choose. Okay. If I have to choose here, I'm going to... Sorry to all. I wish you could all answer, but if I have to choose, I guess I will say to Kyrie.
Okay, Kyrie.
Yeah,
the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sean, for a great question there. Look, two parts. One is whether we can demilitarize, and the first part is this whole thinking around collective security and the agenda for the future. I really think, I mean, this is not an easy thing to do. Many people have tried it in the past, and no one has really succeeded. But we are at a unique point in history where I think we can make it happen. It requires a lot of consensus, as I said before. But you really have to start looking at how you need to reform international institutions. And you need to begin with the United Nations. If you don't reform the United Nations, then you're going to see an increased fragmentation of diplomacy to other fora, like, as I said earlier, BRICS, G7. And that's going to polarize the world even more. The only forum that we have together that we still trust to some extent is the United Nations. And if we miss this chance to reform the United Nations, in particular, when you talk about collective security, in particular the Security Council, then I think this crisis of trust and confidence will continue to exacerbate to the extent that people will walk away from that common fora that we have in the United Nations. So we have to start thinking about what do we do? What do we do about the Security Council? It's not going to be easy because when you reform the Security Council, the membership of the Security Council, when you take a knife to the permanent members and say, we have to admit other people, make sure it's more representative of the global South, etc.
Do you want to remove the veto right, for example? The
veto right is something that needs to be considered. It has to It has to be overridden. Look, you have a situation where it's clear as daylight, Gaza, where the veto protected one country. You can bring a resolution to the General Assembly under Uniting for Peace, and it's ignored because of the veto. You know, the vast majority of the international community votes for a General Assembly Uniting for Peace resolution against Israel, and yet it's vetoed down by one veto. So, of course, the veto has to be challenged. The veto has to be reformed. So, coming back,
can I ask
time.
the other
Yes.
panelists quickly to respond to that? I want to give you both
sure.
a brief moment to respond to Khairi. Bob Dane first.
No, I fully agree. I mean, the UN Security Council represents the post-Second World War security order, right? I mean, it's definitely not inclusive. And we've seen also that one of the members of the UN Security Council, the Russian Federation, is attacking other countries. And of course, then the Security Council is not able to do anything about it. And I think we'll only see more and more of this paralysis going forward. I'd like to go back to Sean's question on this point of common security or sometimes collective security. I spent 12 years of my life working for an organization called the OSCE on security and cooperation in Europe. And it had this idea of comprehensive security. I really liked it. It was actually meant to disarm this security dilemma. I build up armies on my side of the border, so you feel threatened, you build up armies on your side of the border. It was meant to actually diffuse the security dilemma and stop arms races. Problem in it is, it's also paralyzed because countries within the organization are at war with each other. So what you need first, and I'm really sorry that I have to say this, it probably will get worse first before it gets better, before these organizations can really be reformed. And before we go back to the point that we realize that diplomacy and arms control, I'm not talking about disarmament. I would already be happy with arms control, right? Not more warheads, not more conventional weapons. I think that point will come, but I'm afraid it's going to get worse first. Sorry about that.
Can I get a few lines from Dr. Eero about this as well? Very short, briefly, please.
Thank you. You know, I think the whole issue about the veto was exposed when Russia invaded Ukraine, and we had the Zelensky challenge, you know, when he challenged the Security Council, and then you had that innovation by Liechtenstein bringing the veto question to the General Assembly. But Sean, to your question about the summit of the future, I think one thing that we should remember also is that Russia itself has rejected calls from other UN members to use the talks about the summit of the future as an occasion to revitalize diplomacy on nuclear disarmament. So you can already see the stage has been set to water down any really meaningful conversation associated with dealing with collective security. So the big question is, how do you begin to have a very sort of robust, sincere conversation on UN reforms when we can't deal squarely with issues around war and peace as we see it going forward as well. So this is a really challenging time and a very bleak moment as we go into the UN General Assembly summit and the question about the summit of the future. And I think there are a number of skeptics out there who argue about whether the UN itself can continue to play a meaningful role on peace and security when you've got a very dysfunctional Security Council today as well.
Thank you. And also thanks, Sean, for your very interesting question. I want to move on now to the second discussant, and this is Do Shishi Sain, and she's the executive board member of the Myanmar Institute of Strategic and International Studies. Can we hear your question, please, and to whom?
Yes, my question is that how can we find a durable solution for both the Ukraine and the Palestine war with respect to the international law and with respect to the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of both the states? Thank you.
And to who do you want to ask this question first?
Anyone who is interested to answer this question? Sean, yes.
No, we can give it to Khairi.
Can I just, I'll just speak about Palestine quickly, and then I will defer to my other colleagues to bring them in. I just wanted to touch on the two-state solution. This is related to Dorothy's point just now. whether the two-state solution now is the solution at all. My views are very, very similar to Dr. Iro's views, in a sense that you just give me a couple of minutes for context. Malaysia does not recognize the state of Israel. Yet, in our official diplomatic position, foreign policy, we have supported the two-state solution since Oslo. You see, because we are hopeful. We were hopeful after Oslo, and we were hopeful to the extent that we acknowledge that Israel can exist under a two-state solution, even though today we do not acknowledge and recognize the state of Israel. But let's be frank here, apart from the fact that we have to end the genocide, since Oslo, what has Israel done to even come close to a two-state solution? What's been happening in the West Bank with the settlements, what's been happening in Gaza for the last decade, open-air prison, the blockade of Gaza. So you have to start asking yourself the very fundamental question, does Israel itself want a two-state solution? And can it even honor a two-state solution with what it's doing before what happened in Gaza with the genocide? I don't think that they're interested in two-state solution. That's why I've been telling my government that we should drop the two-state solution from our official foreign policy position, and we should just outright call for the recognition and the independence of a Palestinian sovereign state. What happens later, that's later. But if the world community continues to hold on to the two-state solution as a solution to what's happening in Gaza today, I say that even before this present round of genocide, you would be mistaken in thinking that even Israel is committed to a two-state solution.
So, though she was asking for a solution, right? What do you think, Bob Dane? Is this a solution, just to unilaterally recognize Palestine as a state?
Well, many countries have done that, have recognized Palestine as a state, and it still hasn't brought peace. I think the point of the Oslo Accords is that's what needs to happen. It needs to be done in a multilateral format. You can't unilaterally enforce it. And I think if you permit me, Step, to move to my area of expertise, Ukraine, at the same situation, there can't be a solution where the Russian Federation keeps occupying whole chunks of Ukrainian territory and gets away with it. Right, I think that is something that all the countries around the world actually agree on, because nobody has recognized Russian sovereignty over Ukrainian territory. So I think this is the bottom line of where consensus is. There should not be territorial gains through conquest. And I think that applies to the West Bank, and that applies also to Ukraine. The Russian Federation, in this case, should not be allowed to get away with this.
But how hopeful are you that Russia will withdraw from these territories at one day and Ukraine will be the same country as it was before the invasion?
Well, that's the fair point about the difference between principles and pragmatism. I think in reality, before the Russian Federation withdraws, that can only happen if there is some form of instability inside Russia. Because I don't see Vladimir Putin now coming to the conclusion that it was all a mistake and just withdrawing and making a deal. That might happen in the future. If a new Russian leadership comes to the conclusion that this was a mistake or is forced by other means to relinquish these territories. But in practical terms, I think what we see on the horizon in Ukraine is not a comprehensive peace agreement where the underlying reasons for the war are taken away. I think much more likely is an unsatisfactory truce that is only a temporary solution where Russia keeps occupying chunks of Ukraine and nobody accepts this. And the war could flare up again in the future, as we have seen after the last rounds of talks in 2014.
A forgotten war for decades, possibly.
And it could go on but it might not be a hot war for most. Like, for example, the ceasefire that was brokered in 2014, 2015, it was broken many times, but it never escalated into full-scale interstate war until 2022. So it could very well be that a long period of sort of a hostile, cold peace comes to being, but it will not remove the underlying problems, which is that Ukraine wants to make its own choices in the future, where it wants to belong, and Russia wants to retain control over Ukraine in one way or another.
Dr. Ero, do you have the solution that, or the questionnaire, the discussant asked for?
Yeah, I mean, I want to just pick up on what Bob just said, because I think that really is at the heart of the matter. You know, even if you were able to get some kind of truce, or even if the war ends in some kind of amnesty, I think one fact that will not be removed from the table for Western states is that they will still want to deter Russia from future military attacks. And the priority here will be for NATO, for example. But prevention of sort of Russian aggression and Russian aggression throughout Europe and Eurasia will continue to shape sort of NATO's policy as well. So I don't think you can get away from that fact, that realpolitik as well. I mean, as I said, as we've said, Stephen, and the minister himself has said it also, that the train is out of the station in terms of the future of the rights of Palestinians. And I think we can't get away from that fact, that you cannot continue to ignore the aspirations of the Palestinians and where their fate is. And I think, as we said at the outset of the presentation, Sep, even Western countries realize that you saw the way that a number of Western countries broke away from their own position and said, we will recognize Palestinian rights. It's not symbolic, it's a direct message to Israel that the status quo cannot continue to exist in this way, that we cannot continue business as usual, that the world has changed. And now the key question is how we work together in trying to find a different political horizon for the people of Palestine, while continuing to safeguard Israel's own security in the future. There is a path forward to go to the question that you asked. The question is whether a number of key countries that are crucial to that will be prepared to take that leap. And I'll say one more thing just to close out my own remarks as well, which is to what the minister said. Nobody's going to wait for the United States to provide the solution. There are a number of new mediators on the horizon who are trying to craft a way forward. And that's because it speaks directly to their own national security concerns. That's why Qatar's there. That's why Saudi Arabia's at the table. That's why you're seeing Turkey there, because it speaks directly to their own national security concerns as well.
Thank you so much. And also thank you for the question, very important question from Myanmar. And I want to move on now to Poland. We have Jakob Gretam, and he's a member of the Student Association of Pacific Area States from the University of Warsaw. We want to hear your question, please.
Thank you. I would like to ask, we all can see that the world is going through a process of international change, and the new structure will soon emerge. In my opinion, international security is much more in danger than before. And my question is are we going to face next big conflicts like this in Ukraine or in Palestine in the distant future? And if we do, is there any way that we could go through this process peacefully in any terms? Thank you.
To who do you want to ask this question?
I don't have a specific
Anyone.
candidate. Okay, anyone.
But you're asking if there's more conflicts going to happen. That's what you're asking, right?
Exactly.
Are you also asking, for example, if the conflict, the war in Ukraine could go bigger? Because of course you're in Poland, and there's a lot of concern, I know, in Poland about the extension of this war. So maybe Bob Dane can answer this question.
Yeah, I would say with pleasure, but not really with pleasure, because I think it's a grim answer. I think Dr. Ero used the term bleak. It does look quite bleak. I mean, there's three major clusters of conflict. One, fully a hot war, Russia-Ukraine. Second, terrible fighting in Middle East. But that's not yet escalated, and I hope it will not, to full-scale interstate war Israel-Iran. And then the third one is the brewing tensions US-China. If there is a major military confrontation over the South China Sea, we really have a problem. And if these three clusters of conflict start to influence each other, it's even worse. I mean, Mr. Greta, you are in Poland, the country that is investing enormously in defense. I think 4% GDP. It's bought hundreds, if not thousands, of tanks and armored vehicles to prepare for the possibility that there might be more war, that NATO might end up in a direct military confrontation with the Russian Federation. This is not unrealistic. I hope it is still unlikely, because the best deterrence is a strong military. And we see that the Russian Federation struggles already to defeat Ukraine, let alone the united armies of the NATO alliance. But still, that is why all these countries, including my own, are now investing heavily in defense. Of course, with the hope that it will not have to be used. But this is this arms race and the security dilemma, I think, that the previous question of Sean also alluded to. This is the phase we're in. Countries will first arm themselves more, and hopefully through some of the mechanisms that we discussed and in the involvement of also countries outside of Western Europe, we can come to diplomatic solutions rather than a full-scale military confrontation. But I am not convinced that this is 100% certain. This will not happen automatically. We have to invest efforts to achieve a diplomatic solution. Thank you.
Dr. Ero, is militarization really a solution for peace, to maintain peace, to get peace?
No, but we are in an era where military solutions have been the preferred model more and more in a number of sort of zones. And in a sense, diplomacy almost sounds as though it's a dirty word this way, and how you begin to marshal that sort of tidy balance between deterrence and diplomacy and using force to back up a political solution is the challenge of the day. But I want to sort of support what Bob just said right now, because I think he was spot on. Look, quite frankly, right now, no one wants to see a major war, and I think even for all its recklessness in Ukraine, even the Kremlin has been cautious not to provoke sort of direct conflict with NATO. And war at any time between sort of the US and China seems even unlikelier, though it is hard to escape sort of that trajectory towards some form of crisis over Taiwan coming to some heads. I think credit should be given to Biden and Xi Jinping that they had those talks in San Francisco, that we've got now military to military dialogue happening at a high level between both those countries, and both leaders have signaled that they don't want to see some kind of crisis, but I think Taiwan becomes the big one. And then also, you know, the US, Israel and Iran, and certainly all of the Arab capitals also want to avoid a wider sort of Middle East conflagration also. But overall, Sep, though, you know, the risks are uncomfortably high for all the three theatres that you mentioned, Bob. And I think what worries me, what keeps me up awake at night, and I think keeps all of us awake at night, is that one danger does lie in the possible miscalculation, misinterpretation, misunderstanding of an action by one particular actor. So a collision at sea, a collision in the air, or one errant sort of strike could cause sort of some kind of unintended action. So we are, you know, that miscalculation can lead to all sorts of dangerous turns. And I think that is what is troubling. And we saw that twice now in the Middle East back in April, and now more recently. So that what worries me is a miscalculation, a misstep, or misunderstanding on how you read a particular action as well.
And just to throw in the possible elephant in the room here, how worried, or are you worried about a possible Donald Trump presidency?
I mean, I think a number of people, you know, have said, look, a Trump 2.0 could leash a degree of vengeance. You know, it could unleash, you know, sort of unpredictability and uncertain. But, you know, the US politics has been uncertain for the last sort of decade or so, even under the Biden. You know, I should say that it's worth us being a little bit more nuanced in terms of what we saw with Trump, the very first Trump presidency. Despite sort of all the unpredictability around him, there was no major war. I mean, we missed something, maybe. We missed getting close to a war, I think, in terms of the bringing down of the Iranian General Soleimani, and that was a very dangerous moment as well. But this is a president also who doesn't want to get involved in any dangerous sort of military adventure himself, although who knows what would have happened with Biden, with Trump, regarding Afghanistan, for example. It was under Biden that we saw the messy withdrawal. I would be concerned, but I also think, to go back to what the minister says, countries themselves are not waiting for the United States to dictate the terms in which they define international politics. There are a group of states out there who look at this moment as a moment for them to step up, to define the alliances going forward, to shape the international agenda, to craft what international peace and security looks like. And it's not contingent on the West. It's not contingent on the United States. I think it's also contingent on how they view their national security, both within the region and across the international environment as well.
Can I just
yes, please jump in, Khairi.
Yeah, thanks. Just in terms of looking at the global map, we've identified 3 hotspots, Gaza, and the possibility of that becoming a broader conflict in the Middle East, involving Iran perhaps. We've identified, of course, what's happening in Ukraine, and of course what's happening in East Asia. This is with regards to the power contestation, the United States, China, Taiwan, vis-a-vis Taiwan, and even the South China Sea. We're on the doorstep of that in Malaysia and Indonesia. But there are other places I think we should highlight, which we've not spoken of yet. Conflicts that are occurring within countries. Sudan, I think is something that there's no end in sight there. Possible conflict that might escalate in the Caucasus, Azerbaijan, Armenia. So these are other smaller conflict areas, not smaller conflict areas, maybe conflict areas that are outside the traditional headlines that we should also take note of. But the point that I want to say is this, and this speaks to our organizer, the foreign policy community of Indonesia. I want to say that foreign policy is actually local. We spoke just now about diplomacy versus deterrence. We spoke just now about reading the signs wrong. I think it's very important that every country has an active foreign policy community, like the foreign policy community of Indonesia. That shapes how your governments frame foreign policy. That shapes how citizens want their governments and their leaders to delicately balance diplomacy and not just focus on deterrence. Because, I mean, if you leave it to the hawks within the government and the security establishment, of course, it's all about deterrence. But I think the majority of people, especially young people who are interested in foreign policy, they do value the role of dialogue, of diplomacy. So I think it's very, very important, not just thinking about what's going to happen in the United States, but thinking about what's going to happen in our own countries, the discussion about foreign policy in our own countries. Do we think that our citizens have a good enough understanding about foreign issues and international issues? I think if they don't, and we don't contribute to this, it results in mistakes happening.
Exactly, and that's a perfect transition to one of the questions we got from the audience, actually, because one of the questions is how to prevent these conflicts in a bigger system, basically. How should we re-educate ourselves? How can countries teach the younger generations basically to be more peaceful, to avoid these or prevent these conflicts? Is there anyone, Bob, maybe you want to comment on this?
Yeah, and that is the great tragedy. I mean, we all want conflict prevention, right? The famous phrase, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And the UN has wanted this for decades. I remember being an intern at the UN in the early 2000s when it was all about a culture of prevention. And time again, these wars happen. Now, why? I mean, there's lots of reasons for it, but let me then take one. If you ask what we can educate young generations, I'm afraid we have to go back to history education. History has this really nasty habit, not necessarily of repeating itself, but of rhyming, right? Things happen that have happened before. And if we would only remember what caused the First World War, I mean, Dr. Ero mentioned this thing, sleepwalking into war, right? An unintended thing that can cause an escalation. If you remember the causes of the Second World War, the West not standing up against an aggressor, appeasing a dictator, these type of lessons have to be taught again and again throughout generations. The Holocaust, if we forget what that was, that could mean that groups again get marginalized and scapegoated and maybe eventually attacked or eliminated. So we have to invest, and I'm very sorry to say this, I'm not a historian, but in good history education in our future generations. Thank you.
Dr. Ero?
Yeah, thank you. And also, I spend my entire time focusing on prevention, and that's the key, and getting leaders.
But are you still optimistic about it or not? Is there any optimism there?
Absolutely. And, Bob Dean made reference to the protests that were taking place in universities and things like that. These were young people
As we
who were
speak at the moment in London, in the city where you are today, will be a big protest.
Yeah, even in London, these are being led by young people. And if you pay attention to what they're saying, it's all about stepping back and bringing an end to war. So young people are engaged, they're paying attention, they're using their vote as well. So that gives me optimism that there is a consciousness among young people that they want dialogue, that they want diplomacy. But it's making sure that they're armed with the right information. I am deeply concerned about the fact that we're living in an era of misinformation and disinformation, where people have alternative facts to ground truths. So organizations like our foreign policy committee here, Indonesia, and other organizations like yours, Bob, as well, who spend time working on making sure that people have the right information, that people have the right analysis, that people have the right understanding is a major step to making sure that we begin that hard work of moving towards what a solution looks like. So we've got to invest in making sure that we have fact checkers on the ground, that we have the right narrative, and that people do not use disinformation to trigger more polarization. Minister, you're absolutely right that this is very much driven by domestic politics. In every country that we're looking at that is vital to helping solve a solution, what do we see at the heart of a number of these societies? Polarization. And we've got to address that before we can even begin to bring an end to a lot of these conflicts. So that is what is also keeping me up awake at night, the disinformation and polarization, because that is the way in which you begin to solve the solutions that we're having. And it's getting more difficult to deal with this in the disinformation. And Seth, you'll know that as a person who's in the media and journalist, and you spend a lot of time fact checking everything that is said to you as well.
You know, Steph, just a quick one-liner from me. I think, apart from organizations that are playing this role, apart from young people, we need to also hold the big tech companies to account. Some of these platforms create this echo chamber with this black box of algorithms, just repeating the same message to the same crowd, contributing towards more polarization and contributing towards more populism. So I think, you cannot ignore the role of big tech companies in fueling this polarization and this misinformation that's happening around the world.
Absolutely. And as Dr. Aero said, my profession is, of course, very much on the front line of this. I think we're very much struggling. The credibility of the media is very much at stake at the moment, especially with this fake news term that's going around all the time. And I think there's a lot of self-censorship that I notice again. If I look at my colleagues covering the war in Ukraine, but also in Gaza. So we really need a wake-up call, I think, because, we have to uphold the independence of the media. I think that's one of the most important things also as a very strong pillar of democracy. And I think I'm afraid to close this very, very inspiring session. It was very interesting and an honor for me to host three very distinguished guests. And I think, and I'm sure a lot of people, thousands have been listening to us, have been very much inspired and motivated by this. And despite the fact that it's quite a bleak picture that we are painting here, and I totally agree with Dr. Era, I have a lot of sleepless nights myself. It's not a great time, and I'm worried about the next generation, but I'm also very hopeful for the next generation, especially if I also look at the foreign policy community in Indonesia, which I've seen growing in the last, I don't know how many years they're working on this, but it's a huge community with very inspiring young people especially. And I really agree with with Khairi that should be all over the world. We need these communities all over the world. And I think on that note, I want to thank Dr. Era, Bob Dean, and Khairi Jamaluddin for your interesting insights and your time. Thank you so much, and hope to see you next year. Who knows?
The Amazon is under threat. And we need your help to save it. But first, let's talk about why the Amazon matters. The Amazon is one of the most ecologically rich areas of the planet. It's home to 390 billion trees and stores up to 150 billion metric tons of carbon, equivalent to almost 12 years of global emissions. That's why the Amazon is so essential for our survival. But climate change and deforestation, driven by cattle ranching, logging, and agricultural expansion, has brought the Amazon to its tipping point. If lost, the Amazon would release an amount of carbon that would push the global climate beyond safe limits. And despite the fact that they contribute least to the problem, these impacts disproportionately affect the 305 indigenous communities who call the Amazon home. That's why Global Citizen is seeking to secure at least $1 billion in commitments from private, public, and philanthropic sources to protect the Amazon.